divorce papers hit the mahogany table like a death sentence, the sound sharp enough to shatter the silence that had
Sign
calcified
it.
between
It's the
them
only
over
way.
the past
How can I
6
trust
months.
you?
Because I have everything
Marcus
to
Reed
lose.
stood
That's not
by the
enough.
floor-to-ceiling windows of their Seattle penthouse, his silhouette backlit by the city's glittering skyline rain, streaking the glass in rivulets that looked like the bars of a prison Elena Hayes had only just realized she'd been living in. His voice came cold, clinical, the tone he used for junior associates who'd missed a critical deadline. "I'm closing the biggest deal in Seattle history tomorrow, Elena. Reed Dynamics to Titan Global for $4.2 billion. He adjusted his Brooks Brothers tie, the navy silk, catching the light. "I need a wife who fits the vision of a billionaire, not someone who bakes sourdough and visits her father in a cottage that smells like mulch." Elena stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, flour still dusting her hands from the anniversary bread she'd been making. Their 5th anniversary. The cardigan she wore, beige oversized, bought during their Stanford days when Marcus had called her his brilliant girl, suddenly felt like a costume from someone else's life. Her hair hung in a loose ponytail, no makeup, bare feet on the heated marble floor that had cost more than most people's cars. "Are you listening to me, Elena?" She was, every word landing like a surgical cut, precise and designed to sever. "I'm trying to understand, Marcus. Tuesday we were talking about visiting your mother in Vermont for Thanksgiving. Today you're handing me divorce papers." He sighed, the sound heavy with performative patience, and walked to the wet bar. The scotch he poured was Macallan $4,500 a bottle. He didn't offer her any. Never did. "It's not sudden. You've just been oblivious." His hand gestured dismissively at her outfit, her flour-dusted fingers the whole domestic tableau she'd created. "Look at us. I'm the CEO of Reed Dynamics. Tomorrow I move into the billionaire bracket. That means state dinners, galas at the Met Davos in January." "I can't go to Davos." "You'd wear that." The sneer in his voice was sharper than any knife in their designer kitchen. "You're small, Elena. You're content with small things. Baking bread, volunteering at that homeless shelter, visiting your father at that shack of his." The muscles in her jaw tightened. "It's a cottage, Marcus, and he's my father. He's a gardener who smells like fertilizer and cheap tobacco." Marcus laughed, the sound empty of warmth. "Remember the last time he came here, tried to fix the sink with duct tape and a wrench from his truck? I have service contracts for that. 24/7 concierge maintenance. I don't need your blue-collar baggage dragging down my image when I'm sitting across from the Titan Global board." Something cold settled into Elena's chest, crystallizing around her heart. 5 years. 5 years she'd listened to these casual cruelties, each one delivered with the assumption that she'd absorb it, smooth it over, make herself smaller to accommodate his expanding ego. She'd told herself it was the stress of building a company, the pressure of competing in the tech world's gladiatorial arena. She'd believed in the man she'd met at Stanford, the one who'd stayed up until 3 in the morning, helping her debug code, who'd said her mind was the sexiest thing about her. That man had evaporated somewhere between the Series B funding and the penthouse acquisition. Marcus tossed a thick manila envelope onto the marble countertop. It landed with a heavy thud. "The settlement's generous. The condo in Portland fully paid off your name only. The Honda, and $75,000 in cash." He swirled the scotch in his glass, amber liquid catching the light. "Sign tonight and you can be out before the movers come for the furniture tomorrow. I'm redecorating. Vanessa's helping me choose pieces that actually reflect success." The name hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. "Vanessa." Elena's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Vanessa Chen, the new VP of Marketing." Marcus checked his Patek Philippe $40,000 of Swiss precision on his wrist. "She understands this world, Elena. Her father's a federal circuit judge. She went to Choate. She plays tennis at the club, knows which fork to use at state dinners, can discuss market trends without needing everything explained in kindergarten terms." The words kept coming, each one designed to diminish, to erase, to justify. "You're the girl I dated in business school before I understood how big I was going to get. Before I knew what I was building. Vanessa, she's a strategic alignment. She opens doors. Her connections alone are worth millions in potential partnerships. He walked toward the door, grabbing his cashmere coat from the rack. I'm staying at the Four Seasons tonight. I expect those papers signed when I come back tomorrow morning to grab my suit for the closing. Don't make this messy, Elena. You can't afford the lawyers, I can. This is the generous option. Take it. The door clicked shut with a sound of devastating finality. Elena stood in the cathedral-like silence of the multi-million-dollar prison she'd called home, her hands still coated in flour, the anniversary bread dough rising on the counter like a monument to her own foolishness. She didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come dammed up behind a wall of shock so complete it felt like drowning in air. The envelope sat on the counter thick with the paperwork of dissolution. She picked it up with shaking hands, pulled out the documents. The legalese swam before her eyes, but certain numbers jumped out with cruel clarity. $75,000. To Marcus pocket change. Lunch money for a week of business dinners. To anyone else, a life-changing sum. To Elena, an insult wrapped in the pretense of generosity. The condo in Portland was a one-bedroom in an aging building near the industrial district. She'd seen the listing once when Marcus was considering investment properties. Good for working-class renters, he'd said, dismissing it. Now it was her prize for 5 years of marriage. The Honda was a 2015 Civic with 130,000 miles, the car she'd driven before the wedding, the one Marcus had wanted to replace with something appropriate for a CEO's wife. She'd refused, attached to its reliability, its memories of grad school road trips and independence. He'd mocked her for it at dinner parties, called it her emotional support vehicle, while their guests laughed into their wine. She walked to the living room window, looked out at Seattle's glittering sprawl. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably already at the Four Seasons, probably already with Vanessa, celebrating the successful amputation of dead weight before his ascension to the billionaire class. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket. The screen cracked from when she'd dropped it last month and hadn't bothered to replace it. Money for phone repairs felt frivolous when Marcus was complaining about Q3 projections. She pulled it out, the home screen showing a photo from their wedding day, both of them laughing her in a simple dress, him in a suit that cost less than his current tie. When had that man disappeared? When had the transformation from partner to prop become complete? She dialed the number. She hadn't called for anything serious in years. Her father's voicemail picking up immediately. His gravel, warm voice. "You've reached Frank Hayes. Leave a message and I'll get back to you when I'm done with the roses." The beep sounded and her voice cracked. "Dad, I need—" She stopped, swallowed. "Can I come home? I'll be there in 2 hours." She hung up before the tears could start, before the dam could break. The packing took less time than she'd expected. 5 years of marriage condensed into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. She took her clothes, the comfortable ones Marcus had hated, the sweaters and jeans and flannel shirts that made her feel like herself. She took the photos of her father, the small garden stones he'd given her from his travels, each one labeled with the location and date in his careful handwriting. She took her Stanford diploma, still in its leather folder, hidden in the back of the closet behind Marcus's summer suits. She left the designer dresses he'd bought her, the ones with tags that made her nauseated. She left the jewelry, diamond earrings for their 2nd anniversary, a tennis bracelet for their 3rd, each gift presented with less warmth than the last obligation disguised as affection. She left the life-size wedding portrait Marcus had commissioned for the entryway, the one where she looked like a stranger wearing her face. In his study, searching for a pen to sign the papers, she found the file. It was marked Titan Global, Acquisition Terms Confidential, in red letters, sitting on top of his desk, as if he'd been reviewing it that very evening. Elena paused, something in her gut twisting. She shouldn't look. It was his business, his deal, his world she was no longer part of. But her hand reached for her phone anyway, photographing each page. 23 pages of dense legalese and financial projections. She didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that had made her keep backup copies of her own work in grad school, the same careful documentation that had saved her thesis when a lab computer crashed. She placed the file back exactly as she'd found it, signed the divorce papers on the kitchen counter, her signature steady, no tears blurring the ink, and wrote in the margin, "Accepted with gratitude for the lesson. E.H." The wedding ring came off her finger with unexpected ease. She placed it on top of the signed papers, a period at the end of a sentence she should have stopped writing years ago. The rain intensified as she loaded her bags into the Honda, the city washing itself clean while she drove away from the only life she'd known as an adult. The penthouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, and with it the woman who'd believed that making herself smaller would somehow make her marriage bigger. The drive to Oregon blurred into streaks of headlights and rain, the Honda's wipers beating a rhythm that sounded like failure, failure, failure. But underneath it, quieter, steadier, survivor, survivor, survivor. Frank Hayes's cottage sat nestled in the Willamette Valley wine country 90 miles south of Seattle, accessible only by a winding gravel road that Marcus had always refused to navigate. "Too rustic," he'd said, as if rustic was a communicable disease. The cottage itself was small, weathered cedar and river stone surrounded by gardens that seemed to grow wild but were actually meticulously maintained. Frank's whole world in 3 acres. Warm light glowed from the windows as Elena pulled up, the smell of coffee and wood smoke mixing with the rain-fresh air. Her father sat on the covered porch in his rocking chair, wearing flannel and work boots, a thermos of coffee at his side. He'd been waiting. He stood as she got out of the car, and the sight of him, solid, real, unchanging in a world that had just collapsed, finally broke the dam. Elena walked into her father's arms and wept. Great shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and raw. "I've got you, ladybug." His voice was bedrock steady, his arms strong despite his 67 years. "I've got you." He didn't ask questions. Didn't say "I told you so," though he could have. He'd never liked Marcus, had bitten his tongue for 5 years while his daughter made choices he didn't understand. He'd been polite at holidays, cordial at the wedding, but Elena had seen it in his eyes, the assessment, the doubt, the hope that maybe he was wrong. He hadn't been wrong. Inside the cottage was exactly as she remembered, worn leather furniture, bookshelves packed with volumes on agriculture and geology, the wood stove radiating heat. But there were details she'd never noticed before, or perhaps never paid attention to. The books weren't just gardening manuals. There were titles on rare earth mineral extraction, global supply chain logistics, advanced financial modeling. A framed photograph on the mantel showed a younger Frank in a sharp suit shaking hands with President Clinton, both men smiling. "Dad," Elena's voice was raw from crying. "Who are you really?" Frank poured her coffee from the French press, added the cream and sugar she liked without asking. "Sit down, Ladybug. We have some talking to do." They sat in the chairs by the wood stove, the fire crackling, rain drumming on the roof. Frank took his time, the way he did everything deliberate, considered, never wasting movement or words. "I built something a long time ago." He began, his eyes distant with memory. "Before you were born, before your mother got sick. I was young, ambitious, thought I could change the world with the right combination of technology and resources." He sipped his coffee. "I made money. A lot of money. Mining rights in rare earth deposits before most people understood what rare earths were. Infrastructure development for the early internet backbone. Strategic investments in companies that were just ideas in garages." Elena listened, her world tilting on an axis she'd thought was fixed. "I hated it, though. Hated the world that came with the money. The sharks in suits, the people who'd smile at you while calculating how to gut you for profit. The way everyone became a transaction, a potential asset to exploit, or a liability to eliminate." He set down his cup. "So I walked away, set up trusts and holding companies, hired people I trusted to manage the portfolio, and came here. Built this cottage with my own hands. Grew things. Became the person I actually wanted to be." "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. "Because I wanted you to find someone who loved you for you. Not your last name. Not your potential inheritance. Not as an access point to capital or connections." Frank's eyes met hers, fierce with protection. "I thought Marcus was arrogant but hard-working. I thought he'd grow up, learn to see what he had. I was wrong. He walked to an old oak desk in the corner and pulled out a laptop, new, expensive, incongruous with the rustic surroundings. He opened a file marked Read Dynamics, Forensic Analysis, and turned the screen toward her. The data scrolled past in damning columns. Revenue inflation, shell corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada, hidden debt structured through South Dakota trusts, accounting irregularities that transformed from suspicious to criminal as the pages multiplied. "I've been watching his company for 3 months," Frank said, his voice flat with controlled anger. "Since you mentioned he was stressed about the Titan Global deal. Since you started making excuses for why he couldn't make it to Sunday dinners. I wanted to understand what was consuming him. This is—" Elena couldn't finish the sentence. "Securities fraud. Federal crimes. Her husband wasn't just cruel, he was criminal. He's been cooking the books to inflate the sale price," Frank continued. "Projecting revenue that doesn't exist, hiding $380 million in debt through corporate shells. The pension funds that invested in Read Dynamics based on his fraudulent reports, firefighters' retirement money, teachers' savings, nurses who worked 40 years and trusted the market to honor their sacrifice." The coffee Elena had been drinking turned to acid in her stomach. "Why are you showing me this?" Frank closed the laptop. When he looked at her, his expression was unreadable, something between regret and resolve. "Because Titan Global is mine, Elena. I'm the buyer he's been negotiating with for 6 months." The world stopped. No sound but the fire and the rain and her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "I built Titan in the shadows 30 years ago. Rare earth minerals, telecommunications, infrastructure, strategic acquisitions across 17 industries. I own it through a web of trusts and holding companies. Nobody knows my name. I built it that way deliberately. I can walk down any street in America and be invisible, just another old man who likes gardens." Elena's mind raced, trying to reconcile her father, flannel shirts, and dirt under his fingernails with the mysterious trillionaire who owned Titan Global, the corporation that had made Marcus salivate with ambition for half a year. "Marcus has been selling his company to your father." Frank said the words gentle but unforgiving. "And tomorrow morning when he walks into that conference room expecting to become a billionaire, I'm going to be sitting there." The magnitude of it crashed over her. "Dad, that's cruel." Frank's smile was thin, sharp. "What's cruel is what he did to you. What's cruel is defrauding investors. I'm just turning on the lights, showing everyone what he's really built." "You're going to destroy him. I'm going to give him exactly what he's earned. Nothing more, nothing less." Frank leaned forward, his eyes intense. "He wants to be judged solely on his business merits. Fine. Let's judge those merits. Let's see what they're actually worth when subjected to honest accounting and SEC scrutiny." Elena's hands shook. Part of her, the part that was still raw from being called small, from being discarded like defective merchandise, wanted to watch Marcus burn, wanted to see the humiliation on his face when he realized what he'd thrown away. But another part, the part that had loved him once, hesitated. "This feels like revenge, Dad." "It's consequences, Ladybug. There's a difference." Frank's voice softened. "I could have done this quietly if you were still married. Could have let him resign, given him a golden parachute to save you the embarrassment. Family protects family. But he signed those papers. He made it very clear you're not family anymore. So now he gets treated like any other executive who committed securities fraud by the law." He opened a closet Elena had never paid attention to, pulled out a garment bag. Inside was a white suit, elegant and powerful, with lines that suggested both authority and grace. "This was your mother's. She wore it to the One Tech Summit in 1998 when she gave the keynote on ethical AI development. 3,000 people gave her a standing ovation." Elena's breath caught. Her mother had died when she was 12, the memories already fading into impressions of warmth and intelligence and unconditional love. She'd never known about the keynote, the standing ovation, the life her mother had lived before cancer reduced everything to hospital rooms and hope. "She wanted you to have it when you were ready to step into your own power." Frank said. "I think tomorrow you're ready. What do you need me to do?" "Sign the divorce papers you already did good. Eliminate any legal ties that could complicate what comes next. Then come to Reed Dynamics headquarters at 11 a.m. I'll be in the boardroom at 10 with Marcus and his team. You'll arrive after the revelation, after he understands what he's lost." Frank pulled another folder from the desk, this one marked Board Resolution, Reed Dynamics Transition. "There's a seat on the board waiting for you, Chief Strategy Officer reporting directly to the interim CEO, which will be me until we find someone permanent or you decide you want the job." "Dad, I haven't worked in tech since Marcus convinced you that your logistics algorithms were cute hobby projects instead of the revolutionary supply chain optimization that actually made Reed Dynamics viable." Frank's voice carried an edge of long-suppressed anger. "Since he took credit for your code in front of investors while you stood there smiling like it was fine, you have an MBA from Stanford where you finished top of your class. You built the routing system that's currently moving 60% of West Coast medical supplies. You're more qualified than half the executives Marcus hired based on golf handicaps and family connections." Elena looked at the white suit, at her father's determined face, at the forensic analysis that detailed Marcus's crimes. Looked at the choice being offered: slink away with $75,000 and a used Honda, or step into the fire and reclaim what had always been hers. "What happens tomorrow?" Frank's smile was grim. "Tomorrow, I go to Reed Dynamics dressed as myself, flannel shirt, work boots, the whole gardener aesthetic Marcus loves to mock. I let him humiliate me in front of his team, let him show everyone exactly who he is when he thinks he's talking to someone powerless. Then I introduce myself properly. Chairman of Titan Global here to discuss why the acquisition is no longer proceeding as planned." "He'll lose everything." "He already lost everything when he handed you those papers. He just doesn't know it yet." Elena stood, walked to the window, looked out at the gardens her father tended with such care. Each plant chosen deliberately, each bed designed for both beauty and purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing accidental, the garden of a man who understood that real growth required patience, planning, and respect for the fundamental nature of things. Marcus had treated her like a weed to be pulled. He was about to learn what happened when you disrespected the gardener. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steady. 11 a.m. "And Dad, thank you for believing I was worth more than $75,000 in a used car." Frank crossed to her, put his weathered hand on her shoulder. "You were always priceless, Ladybug. Some people are just too blind to see treasure when it's right in front of them." Sleep didn't come easily that night, Elena's mind racing through 5 years of marriage, searching for the moment when love had curdled into contempt. Had it been gradual, a slow erosion she'd normalized? Or had Marcus always been this person, the cruelty simply masked by the performance of courtship? She remembered their first date coffee at a campus cafe, talking about the ethics of AI decision-making in autonomous vehicles. He'd challenged her ideas, but listened to her arguments, actually engaged instead of dismissed. When had that stopped? When had her thoughts become background noise to his monologues about market share and competitive advantages? Their wedding had been small, just 30 people in a garden ceremony. Her father had walked her down a path between rose bushes, his hand steady on her arm, his eyes questioning even as he smiled. "You're sure?" he'd asked. "You're absolutely sure." She'd been sure. 28 years old, brilliant career ahead of her, a man who seemed to value her mind as much as he desired her body. What wasn't to be sure about the warning signs had been there. The way Marcus had suggested she take a break from her postdoc research to support his launch. The way he'd edited her LinkedIn profile to emphasize supportive spouse over her own accomplishments. The gradual isolation from her grad school friends, the declining invitations to speak at conferences, the narrowing of her world until it was bounded by his needs, his schedule, his vision of who she should be. She'd let it happen. That was the part that hurt most. She'd been complicit in her own diminishment, making herself smaller because it seemed easier than fighting, than insisting on space that he clearly didn't want to give her. But tomorrow Tomorrow she'd show him the woman she'd buried to make room for his ego. Morning came gray and rain-soaked, the Willamette Valley shrouded in mist. Elena stood in front of the mirror in her childhood bedroom. Frank had kept it exactly as she'd left it for college, a shrine to the girl she'd been before Marcus Reed had convinced her to remodel herself. The white suit fit perfectly, her mother's frame apparently identical to her own. The fabric was structured but not stiff, powerful without being aggressive. She paired it with simple diamond studs, her grandmother's not Marcus's, and low heels that said professional, not desperate. Her hair she left down dark waves falling to her shoulders, makeup minimal but strategic. This wasn't armor, this was revelation. Frank appeared in the doorway dressed in his gardening costume, faded overalls, flannel shirt, with a coffee-stained muddy work boots that had seen 1,000 days of honest labor. The juxtaposition was almost comical, her mother's power suit versus his calculated humility. "You look like you could run the world," Frank said, pride evident in every syllable. "I look like I'm about to ruin someone's day." "Same thing sometimes." They drove separately. Frank's ancient F-150 truck and Elena's Honda, a caravan of people Marcus Reed had dismissed as beneath notice. The drive to Seattle passed in a blur of gray highway and gathering clouds, the weather matching the mood, oppressive, heavy with the weight of storms about to break. Frank's phone buzzed with updates from his security team. Marcus had arrived at Reed Dynamics at 8:30, accompanied by Vanessa Chen in a red power dress that screamed "try hard" to anyone with actual taste. They'd done a lap of the executive floor, Marcus pointing out features of his kingdom, Vanessa playing the role of admiring consort with theatrical enthusiasm. The Titan Global legal team had arrived at 9:15, 6 attorneys in black suits, led by Arthur Sterling, a legendary corporate lawyer whose reputation made grown executives weep. They'd been directed to the executive waiting area where Frank was already positioned, thermos of coffee in hand, newspaper spread across his lap, playing the role of vagrant with method actor commitment. Elena waited in a coffee shop 3 blocks away, watching the clock tick toward 11, her heart rate increasing with each passing minute. Her phone buzzed a text from an unknown number. She opened it to find a photo from inside Reed Dynamics. Marcus's face red with fury, gesturing at her father, while Sterling and the other lawyers watched with expressions of professional detachment. Another text: "He called security twice. Sterling shut it down both times. Your dad is enjoying this way too much." Elena smiled despite the nerves eating at her stomach. Somewhere in that building, the man who'd called her small was learning exactly how big the world really was. At 10:45, she stood, smoothed the white suit, checked her reflection one final time in the coffee shop window. The woman looking back was a stranger, wearing her face confident, powerful, dangerous in the way that competence always was to mediocrity. She walked the 3 blocks with purpose, each step a declaration. The rain had stopped the clouds breaking to reveal patches of blue, the pathetic fallacy so on the nose it almost made her laugh. Reed Dynamics headquarters rose before her, all glass and steel and corporate ambition, Marcus's monument to himself etched in architectural form. The lobby was chaos-controlled assistants running with tablets, lawyers reviewing documents, security personnel stationed at intervals with the rigid posture of people who'd been warned to expect trouble. The energy crackled with the voltage of a major deal, billions of dollars shifting hands, careers being made or destroyed by the stroke of a pen. Elena walked past it all like she owned it, because in a few minutes she effectively would. The executive elevators required a key card. Elena pulled hers from her purse. Marcus had never bothered to deactivate it, probably hadn't even remembered she had it. The oversight was so perfectly characteristic of his arrogance that she almost felt grateful for it. The elevator rose in silence, her reflection multiplied in the mirrored walls, an infinite array of women in white suits, each one ready for battle. The doors opened on the 80th floor. The executive waiting area stretched before her, all leather and chrome and intimidating art. And there, sitting on a $10,000 sofa with muddy boots propped on the glass coffee table, was her father, looking for all the world like a homeless man who'd wandered in from the rain. The boardroom doors were closed, but voices leaked through Marcus's, raised in indignation, another voice calm and unruffled responding, Sterling probably delivering bad news in the emotionless tone of a surgeon explaining inoperable cancer. Elena walked to the reception desk. The assistant, a young woman who'd always been kind, who Marcus treated like human furniture, looked up and gasped. "Mrs. Reed, I didn't know you were—" "It's Ms. Hayes now," Elena said gently. "Is the board meeting still in session?" "Yes, but—" The assistant glanced at the closed doors. "It's gotten intense. Mr. Reed has been—" The boardroom doors burst open. Marcus stood framed in the doorway. His Brooks Brothers suit rumpled his face the color of raw meat, his carefully styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it. His eyes locked on Elena, and for a moment nothing existed but the shock detonating across his features. "Elena." Her name came out strangled. "What are you doing here?" She smiled, the expression cold enough to frost glass. "Hello, Marcus. I believe there's a board meeting I'm supposed to attend." Behind him she could see into the boardroom Arthur Sterling at the head of the table, the Titan Global legal team arrayed like a firing squad, documents spread across the polished mahogany. And her father, still in his overalls and muddy boots, sitting in the chairman's seat like he'd been born to it. Frank met her eyes across the distance and nodded once. Permission. Acknowledgement. Pride. Elena walked past Marcus into the room that was about to become his personal apocalypse, ready to reclaim everything he'd tried to take from her, ready to show him that small was a choice and she'd just chosen to be infinite. The boardroom smelled of leather and desperation, expensive cologne mixing with the acrid scent of fear that clung to Marcus like a second skin. Elena watched him struggle to process her presence, his brain clearly short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the woman he'd dismissed with $75,000 standing before him in a suit that cost more than his monthly car payment. Arthur Sterling rose from his seat, extending a hand that spoke of Ivy League breeding and courtrooms where fortunes disintegrated. "Ms. Hayes, welcome. Your father has been explaining the complications with the acquisition timeline." Elena shook his hand, her grip firm, meeting his eyes with the directness she'd learned from watching her mother command conference rooms. "Complications seems like a gentle word for securities fraud, Mr. Sterling." Marcus flinched as if she'd struck him. "Elena, what are you— This is corporate espionage. You can't just walk into a confidential business meeting." "I can when I'm on the board." Her voice carried the chill of January wind off Puget Sound. "My father appointed me Chief Strategy Officer effective this morning. All the paperwork is filed with the Washington State Secretary of State's office. I believe you'll find everything in order." She walked to the empty chair beside Frank, who remained sprawled in his overalls like a king on a throne made of mockery. The muddy boots still rested on the edge of the conference table, leaving faint dirt marks on the glossy surface that probably cost more per square foot than most people's homes. Marcus's mouth opened and closed, a fish drowning in air. "This is insane. You signed the divorce papers. You agreed to the settlement. You walked away." "I signed papers dissolving our marriage," Elena corrected, settling into the leather chair with the ease of someone who belonged. "I never agreed to disappear. That was your assumption, not my promise." Vanessa Chen stood near the windows, her red dress suddenly looking less like power and more like a matador's cape designed to distract before the kill. Her face had gone pale, the careful makeup unable to hide the fear blooming beneath. She'd been quiet during the revelation, smart enough to recognize when the script had been rewritten without her input. Frank picked up the forensic accounting report, its pages flagged with sticky notes in rainbow colors marking each instance of fraud. "Marcus, we've been reviewing your financials. The real ones, not the fairy tales you've been telling investors." His voice was conversational, almost friendly, the tone of someone discussing gardening techniques. "Want to explain why Q2 revenue shows $8.4 million in contracts that don't actually exist. Those are pipeline deals, standard future projections. They're fabrications." Sterling's interruption carried the weight of federal law. "Blue Horizon Capital, LLC, registered in Delaware under your personal signature, shows billing read dynamics for consulting services that never occurred. The payments totaling $2.1 million went directly to an account in your name. That's embezzlement, not creative accounting." Marcus's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog shock, rage, calculation, terror. He grabbed the edge of the table, knuckles white. If you were still my father-in-law, we could handle this quietly. Family doesn't destroy family over... But I'm not your father-in-law. Frank's boots hit the floor with a thud that echoed like a gavel. You made that extremely clear yesterday when you threw $75,000 at my daughter like she was a problem you could pay to disappear. You told her she was small, Marcus. You measured her value in Honda Civics and Portland condos. Now let's measure yours. The air in the room crystallized, every breath visible with tension. Elena watched Marcus's face as understanding finally penetrated his armor of arrogance. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a dismantling. Sterling pulled out another document, this one stamped with the SEC's official seal. We've been in contact with the Securities and Exchange Commission since 6 this morning. They've granted us preliminary approval to withdraw the acquisition offer pending investigation into Reed Dynamics' financial statements. Without Titan's purchase, your stock currently trading at $240 per share based on the anticipated deal will collapse. You can't. Marcus's voice broke on the second word. The market knows about the acquisition. If you pull out now, investors will panic. The stock will tank. Reed Dynamics will be worthless by close of business. Frank smiled, the expression containing no warmth, just the satisfaction of a man watching natural consequences unfold. Exactly. And when it hits rock bottom, let's say around $12 per share, which is roughly what your company's worth with honest accounting, Titan will purchase controlling interest at fair market value. We'll own your patents, your infrastructure, your client contracts, everything you built on the backs of lies. That's corporate murder for revenge. Marcus slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. You're destroying a billion-dollar company just to punish me for divorcing your daughter. I'm a trillionaire son. Frank leaned back, fingers steepled in front of him like a professor explaining basic math to a struggling student. I can afford to burn $1 billion to teach a lesson about integrity. Besides, this isn't punishment. This is what happens when you steal from firefighters' pension funds. Elena pulled up a file on the tablet in front of her, numbers and names scrolling across the screen in damning columns. Washington State Firefighters Pension Plan invested $4 million based on your fraudulent Q2 projections. Teachers Union Retirement Fund, another $6 million. These aren't abstract market players, Marcus. These are people who work 60-hour weeks and trust that the system won't rob them blind. She looked up, met his eyes, saw him really looking at her for perhaps the first time in years. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everyone who believed in what you were building. Vanessa moved from her position by the windows, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Marcus, maybe we should consider... Shut up. He rounded on her, the veneer of charm stripped away to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. This is your fault. If you'd vetted the Titan team properly, if you'd done your job instead of picking out furniture... My job... Vanessa's voice went sharp as broken glass. My job was marketing VP, not accomplice to securities fraud. You want someone to blame? Try the mirror. The crack in their alliance was visible now, a fissure that would become a chasm within hours. Elena almost felt sorry for Marcus, watching his world fracture in real time, every support beam he'd counted on revealing itself as rotted through. Sterling cleared his throat, the sound calling the room to order like a judge's gavel. Mr. Reed, we need to discuss transition logistics. As of 10:15 this morning, Titan Global exercised the material adverse change clause in the acquisition agreement. The deal is void. Your board of directors, minus yourself, and the 2 members facing their own fraud investigations, voted 7-3 to accept emergency bridge financing from Titan to prevent immediate bankruptcy. My board wouldn't. Marcus stopped, reality dawning like a sunrise made of acid. You bought them. We offered them the truth, Frank corrected. Showed them the forensic accounting, the SEC preliminary findings, the civil liabilities stacking up like cordwood. Gave them a choice: jump from the burning building with a parachute or ride it down to the ground. 7 were smart enough to jump. Elena pulled out another tablet, this one showing a live feed of Reed Dynamics' stock price. The numbers were hemorrhaging in real time, dropping from 240 to 198 to 173 as word leaked to trading floors that something had gone catastrophically wrong. She could almost hear the phones ringing in brokerage houses, panicked investors demanding answers that didn't exist. The press conference is scheduled for noon. Sterling continued his tone, suggesting he was discussing lunch plans rather than professional execution. Titan Global will announce the discovery of accounting irregularities that require independent audit. The SEC will simultaneously announce their investigation. By 1 p.m. trading will be halted pending resolution. Marcus's legs seemed to give out. He collapsed into a chair, head in his hands, the expensive haircut unable to hide the way his shoulders shook. I built this company. 8 years of my life, sleeping 4 hours a night, sacrificing everything. You built it on my code. Elena's voice cut through his self-pity like a scalpel through infected tissue. The logistics routing system that handles medical supply distribution. I wrote that in our apartment while you were out playing golf with investors. The predictive inventory algorithm that manages 70% of West Coast hospital supplies mine. The automated vendor negotiation framework. Also mine. She stood, walked to the windows overlooking Seattle's downtown core, the Space Needle visible through breaking clouds. You told investors you developed revolutionary AI-driven logistics. You gave TED Talks about your innovative approach to supply chain optimization. You accepted awards for technical achievement. And all of it, every line of code that actually works, came from the woman you called small. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of the building's HVAC and the distant sound of rain starting again. I never took credit, Marcus started, but even he couldn't finish the lie. You took credit every time you didn't correct them, Elena said, turning back to face him. Every interview where you talked about my technical innovations, every board meeting where you presented my vision for automated logistics. You didn't steal with your hands, Marcus. You stole with your silence. Vanessa made a small sound, half laugh, half sob. Oh God, that's why the Helix project failed. You couldn't replicate her work without her. Marcus's head snapped up. The Helix project is proprietary. The Helix project is why we're really here. Frank pulled out yet another folder, this one thicker than all the others combined. You spent $90 million trying to build a next-generation routing system for autonomous medical drones. Promised investors it would revolutionize emergency medicine. Except you couldn't make it work because you didn't actually understand the underlying mathematics. So you cut safety protocols, skipped testing phases, and rushed a prototype to demonstration. Sterling picked up the narrative without missing a beat. That prototype crashed in a parking lot in Tacoma 3 months ago. Fortunately, it was carrying test equipment instead of defibrillators. Unfortunately for you, the FAA has been investigating. They've concluded the crash resulted from inadequate safety margins in the navigation algorithm, corners cut to meet an impossible deadline. No one was hurt. This time. Elena's voice could have frozen the rain outside. But you certified it as safe for medical payload. You told hospitals they could trust it with time-sensitive medications with emergency blood supplies. If that crash had happened during a real emergency, someone could have died waiting for equipment that never arrived. The weight of it seemed to crush Marcus further into his chair. The man who'd strutted through their penthouse discussing billion-dollar valuations now looked like he was calculating the years in a federal prison sentence. Frank stood his overalls and flannel, somehow more authoritative than any suit could be. Here's what happens next, Marcus. Security will escort you from the building. Your access cards, company devices, and keys will be confiscated. You're barred from all Reed Dynamics facilities pending the investigation. You can't. I'm the CEO, the founder. You're a criminal who hasn't been arrested yet. Frank's voice carried no anger, just the flat certainty of a man stating observable fact. The only reason you're not in handcuffs right now is professional courtesy, while we transfer company assets to prevent complete collapse. That courtesy expires the moment you leave this room. Marcus looked at Elena, something desperate flickering in his eyes. You can't let them do this. 5 years, Elena. 5 years we built a life together. That has to mean something. She considered him for a long moment, this man she'd loved, this stranger wearing his face. It meant everything. To me. That's why this hurt so much, not the losing you part, but realizing I never actually had you. I had a performance, a role you were playing until you decided you needed a different actress. Walking to the door, she paused with her hand on the handle. And Marcus' silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. The hallway outside exploded with activity as she emerged. Security personnel were already moving into position, 2 former military types with earpieces and the bearing of people who'd done this dance before. They nodded at her respectfully, then moved past into the boardroom to collect Marcus. Vanessa slipped out behind them, her red dress suddenly looking ridiculous against the corporate gray carpet and harsh fluorescent lighting. She caught Elena's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "I need to talk to you." Elena looked at the hand on her sleeve, then at Vanessa's face. Up close, the makeup couldn't hide the calculating intelligence in her eyes, the way she was already running scenarios and measuring angles. "You're sleeping with my ex-husband and helped him commit fraud. What could we possibly have to discuss?" "Immunity." Vanessa released her grip, stepped back, hands raised in a gesture of supplication that didn't quite reach genuine. "I kept duplicate records, every falsified report, every shell company transaction, every bribe to city zoning commissioners for facility approvals. I have dates, amounts, and email trails." Elena tilted her head, studying this woman Marcus had chosen as her replacement. "Why would you document his crimes?" "Because I learned a long time ago that when you sleep with the boss, you need insurance." Vanessa's smile was brittle as January ice. "I'm not loyal to Marcus, Ms. Hayes. I'm loyal to my career. And right now my career's best option is cooperating with the investigation in exchange for protection from prosecution." The sheer mercenary pragmatism of it was almost refreshing after Marcus's self-deluding justifications. Elena pulled out her phone, typed a quick text to Sterling. "VP Marketing wants to deal. Claims documentary evidence of fraud and municipal corruption." The response came in seconds. "Conference Room B, 10 minutes. I'll have the U.S. Attorney on video." "Conference Room B, 10 minutes," Elena relayed. "Come with complete records and a willingness to testify under oath. If you're holding anything back, they'll find it and your immunity disappears." Vanessa nodded, already pulling out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. "I have everything in encrypted cloud storage. Access codes are in a safety deposit box at First National. I can have it all within the hour." "Then I suggest you start retrieving it." Elena moved to walk away, then paused. "Vanessa, why did you do it? Sleep with him, help him cook the books, all of it." The question hung between them, honest in a way that felt strange given the circumstances. Vanessa looked at her for a long moment, and something like regret flickered across her carefully maintained expression. "Because I thought he was what success looked like. Confidence, ambition, vision. I thought attaching myself to his trajectory would accelerate my own." She laughed, the sound empty. "Turns out I confused arrogance for confidence, recklessness for ambition, and delusion for vision. By the time I realized what he actually was, I was already complicit." "You could have walked away." "So could you." Vanessa's response wasn't cruel, just factual. "We both made choices based on who we thought he was, instead of who he actually showed us he was. The difference is, you got out. I tried to profit." There was a twisted honesty in that, a self-awareness Marcus would never possess. Elena found herself nodding. "Conference Room B. Don't be late." She walked away, leaving Vanessa to her calculations and compromises, and headed for the elevators. The executive floor had emptied rapidly, employees scattering like pigeons from a hawk's shadow. Word was spreading through the building at digital speed. The CEO was being escorted out. The deal had collapsed. Everything was falling apart. In the lobby, she caught sight of Marcus being walked out by security. His Brooks Brothers suit wrinkled, his face ashen. Employees lined the glass walls of conference rooms, watching their leaders walk with expressions ranging from shock to vindication to fear for their own jobs. The architects of his humiliation had ensured maximum visibility, turning his departure into a company-wide spectacle. He saw her through the glass, their eyes meeting across the marble expanse of the lobby. She didn't look away, didn't give him the satisfaction of her discomfort or the comfort of her sympathy. Just watched as he was escorted through the revolving doors and into the Rain Security's hands, gentle but firm on his elbows. Outside the scene was already chaos. News vans had materialized with the supernatural speed that only comes from tipped-off journalists who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Cameras swiveled toward Marcus reporters shouting questions that dissolved into an incomprehensible roar. Elena turned away from the spectacle and found her father standing beside her, having traded his overalls for a simple charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe. The transformation was startling. Frank Hayes the gardener had vanished, replaced by Frank Hayes the chairman, and the latter was considerably more intimidating. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Elena considered the question honestly. "Empty. I thought I'd feel triumphant or vindicated or something, but mostly I just feel hollow. Revenge never tastes as good as justice, but justice doesn't come with the flavor you'd expect either." Frank guided her toward the private elevators away from the gathering crowd of employees. "What you're feeling is the weight of consequences. Marcus destroyed himself, but you had to watch it happen. That's not comfortable even when it's deserved." They rode the elevator to the top floor in silence, stepping out into the CEO's suite. Marcus's domain now empty and waiting for new occupancy. The desk was still cluttered with his personal effects, a photo of him accepting an award, a signed baseball from some tech mogul, a paperweight made of polished rare earth minerals that he'd probably never realized were the foundation of her father's fortune. Frank walked to the windows, hands clasped behind his back. "The board wants you to consider the permanent CEO position. You've got the credentials, the technical background, and frankly you understand this company better than Marcus ever did, since you built half of it." "I need time to think about that." Elena sank into the chair, not Marcus's throne-like monstrosity, but the smaller one by the window where she'd sat during the rare times he'd allowed her to visit his office. 6 hours ago I was signing divorce papers in a cottage in Oregon. Now you're asking me to run a company with 6,000 employees. I'm asking you to save those 6,000 jobs." Frank turned to face her. "Without intervention, Reed Dynamics declares bankruptcy by end of week. With Titan's bridge financing and competent leadership, it survives. Those firefighters whose pensions Marcus gambled with, they get their money back. The nurses, the teachers, the everyday investors who trusted him, they don't lose everything." The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a yoke. "That's not fair pressure, Dad." "It's not pressure, it's reality. You don't have to decide today. But the board meets Monday morning, and they need an answer." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, placed it on the desk. "This is the formal offer. Read it, think about it. Talk to whoever you need to talk to. Just remember you're not choosing whether to save Marcus's company. You're choosing whether to save what you built from his incompetence." A knock on the door interrupted before Elena could respond. Frank's executive assistant, a efficient woman in her 50s who radiated the kind of competence that held corporations together, stepped inside. "Sir, the SEC conference call is ready in 5 minutes, and Ms. Chen's attorney has arrived with her documentation. It's extensive. Tell them we'll be right there." Frank looked back at Elena. "You don't have to be in on this part. The legal mechanics of prosecution are tedious and ugly. I want to know everything he did." Elena stood smoothing her mother's white suit. "Every lie, every theft, every corner he cut. If I'm going to decide whether to take this company, I need to understand how deep the rot goes." The conference room where Vanessa waited looked like a murder board in a police procedural. Documents covered the table in organized chaos, each stack labeled with sticky notes in Vanessa's precise handwriting: Q1 revenue fraud, Q2 shell company transfers, Helix safety violations, zoning bribe documentation. Vanessa herself sat at the head of the table with her attorney, a shark-eyed woman from one of Seattle's white shoe firms who specialized in turning state's evidence clients into protected witnesses. The red dress had been replaced by a conservative navy suit, the transformation from temptress to professional witness complete. "Ms. Hayes," the attorney stood extending a hand, "Miriam Rothstein. My client has asked me to facilitate her cooperation with the investigation into Reed Dynamics' financial irregularities." Elena shook her hand, noting the firm grip and calculating gaze. This was a woman who measured everyone for weaknesses, cataloging leverage points automatically. "I'm not the prosecutor, Ms. Rothstein. I'm just here to understand what my ex-husband was doing while I was baking bread and being small." Vanessa flinched at that, the barb landing cleanly. "I deserve that. You deserve considerably more than that." Elena sat across from her, the table a demilitarized zone between them. "But right now I'm more interested in documentation than recrimination. Walk me through it." What followed was a masterclass in corporate fraud, Vanessa narrating Marcus's descent into criminality with the detached precision of an accountant reviewing legitimate expenses. It had started small, slightly optimistic revenue projections that became firm commitments in investor presentations. Contracts that were verbally agreed but never signed counted as completed deals in quarterly reports. Small exaggerations that compounded into systematic deception. The shell companies had come next, Delaware and Nevada LLCs that existed only on paper, created to shuffle money between accounts and make debts disappear into corporate structure labyrinth. Blue Horizon Capital had billed Reed Dynamics for consulting services that never happened. Apex Holdings had purchased equipment that never existed. Each transaction carefully documented in official ledgers, each one completely fraudulent. The Helix project is where it gets criminal. Vanessa pulled out a folder thick enough to be a novel, pages flagged with red tabs. Marcus promised the board and investors a working prototype in 18 months. The actual engineering team said it would take 3 years minimum to develop something safe. Marcus fired the team lead and brought in people who'd say what he wanted to hear. She spread out emails, their timestamps telling a story of increasing desperation. Engineers raising safety concerns, Marcus overruling them. FAA certification requirements being dismissed as bureaucratic overcaution. Test failures being buried in progress reports that emphasized minor successes while omitting catastrophic problems. He knew it wasn't ready when he demonstrated it to potential hospital clients. Elena's voice was flat with horror as she read through the technical assessments. The navigation system had a 40% failure rate in simulation, and he loaded it with equipment and flew it over a populated area. He said the simulation was flawed, that real-world performance would be better. Vanessa's hands shook slightly as she spoke. "I was in the room when the engineers told him that's not how aerospace testing works, that you validate in simulation before risking real flights. He told them they were cowards killing innovation." Frank had been silent until now, reading through documents with the focused intensity of a prosecutor building a case. "How much did the city zoning commission get for fast-tracking the drone testing permits?" $50,000 split between 3 commissioners. Vanessa pulled out another file, this one containing bank records with highlighted transfers. Paid through consulting fees to their private companies. Standard bribery dressed up as legitimate business expenses. The scope of it was staggering. Marcus hadn't just committed fraud, he'd built an empire on fraud, each lie requiring another lie to support it, the whole structure growing more precarious with every passing quarter. And underneath it all, the fundamental truth: he'd stolen Elena's work, taken credit for her innovations, and when he couldn't replicate her genius, he'd cut corners until the whole edifice threatened to collapse on top of everyone who'd trusted him. Sterling had joined them via video conference, his face filling a wall-mounted screen with the expression of a man reviewing a particularly rich crime scene. "Ms. Chen, the U.S. Attorney's Office is prepared to offer you immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony and full cooperation. That means depositions, trial testimony if it comes to that, and complete access to all documentation you've described." "I understand." Vanessa's voice was steady despite the pale cast to her features. "I'll provide everything. Emails, financial records, witness statements from other employees who raised concerns. All of it." "Why?" The question came from Elena before she could stop it. "Why document everything if you were complicit? Why keep evidence of your own crimes?" Vanessa met her eyes, and for the first time something genuine flickered in her expression. Not remorse exactly, but a weary self-awareness. Because men like Marcus always need someone to blame when everything falls apart. I learned that from my first job out of college, watching my boss throw his assistant under the bus for his insider trading. I swore I'd never be the fall guy. "So you made sure Marcus would be." "I made sure I'd have options." Vanessa's correction was subtle but important. If the fraud had never been discovered, these records would have stayed encrypted forever. But the moment I saw your father in that waiting room, I knew exactly what was happening. And I knew my options were testify or go to prison alongside Marcus. The pure survival instinct of it was almost admirable in its clarity. Vanessa Chen wasn't a victim or a hero. She was a pragmatist who'd calculated the odds and chosen the path most likely to preserve her freedom and career. It wasn't noble, but it was honest in a way Marcus's self-justifying narcissism could never be. Sterling's voice cut through Elena's thoughts. "We'll need you to come to the U.S. Attorney's Office Monday morning to formalize the immunity agreement. 9 a.m. sharp. Bring everything." "I'll be there." Vanessa stood her attorney gathering documents back into organized stacks. "Ms. Hayes, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. About the affair, about enabling his worst impulses, about not speaking up sooner. You deserved better than what either of us gave you." Elena considered the apology, turning it over in her mind like a stone with unexpected facets. "You're right. It doesn't fix anything. But it might save some people's pensions, and that's worth more than your guilt or my forgiveness." After they left, the conference room felt cavernous. The evidence of Marcus's crimes spread across the table like the aftermath of a disaster. Frank began gathering the documents into file boxes, his movements methodical. "You need to eat something," he said without looking up from his organizing. "And sleep. This will all still be here tomorrow." "I'm not tired." Elena picked up one of the Helix project files, skimming through engineering reports that Marcus had ignored, safety warnings he'd dismissed, regulations he'd circumvented. "I'm angry. He could have killed someone with this thing, all because his ego couldn't accept that he needed more time, more testing, more humility. Anger's useful as long as you don't let it make decisions for you." Frank sealed the last box, labeled it with a marker. "The question isn't whether Marcus deserves punishment, he does. The question is what you do with what's left after the punishment's done." They took the private elevator down to the parking garage, the building around them settling into the quiet of after hours, most employees having fled once word of the executive implosion spread. Elena's Honda sat in a visitor spot, modest and practical, next to the fleet of luxury vehicles in the reserved spaces. "Go back to the cottage tonight," Frank suggested, reading her hesitation. "Or I can get you a suite at the Four Seasons if you want to stay in the city." The Four Seasons, where Marcus was staying, where he'd probably already checked out or been asked to leave once the news hit. The thought of being in the same building made her skin crawl. "The cottage," she decided. "I need some distance from all this." The drive south through evening traffic gave her time to process the radio, mercifully ignorant of the personal apocalypse she'd just witnessed. Normal people discussing normal problems. Traffic backups on I-5, a new restaurant opening in Fremont, the Mariners' chances next season. The world continuing to turn despite the fact that hers had just inverted. Her phone buzzed with texts as cellular signal improved outside the city's concrete canyons. Most were from numbers she didn't recognize, reporters probably somehow already getting her personal information. But one was from a name she hadn't seen in years. Dr. Sophia Chen, her thesis advisor from Stanford, the woman who'd first told her that her logistics algorithms were revolutionary. Saw the news about Reed Dynamics. Proud of you for standing up. Call if you need to talk. The offer to finish your postdoc still stands. S. The message made her eyes sting with unexpected emotion. Someone remembered who she'd been before Marcus had convinced her that wife was a more important title than doctor. Someone still believed in the work she'd abandoned to support his dreams. The cottage appeared through the rain like a refuge, warm lights glowing in the windows. Frank's truck already parked outside. He'd left Seattle an hour before, her letting her have space to think. Inside, the wood stove radiated heat, and the smell of something savory filled the air. "Beef stew," Frank called from the kitchen. "Your mother's recipe. Figured you could use comfort food." They ate in companionable silence, the kind that only exists between people who've known each other long enough that words become optional. The stew was perfect, rich and hearty, seasoned the way her mother had taught Frank decades ago, each bite a memory of better times. "The board meeting is Monday at 9, Frank said, finally setting down his empty bowl. "Sterling will present the legal situation. The interim CFO will present the financial situation, which is grim but survivable with the bridge financing. And they'll ask if you're willing to take the CEO position on a permanent basis." "What if I say no?" "Then we bring in a professional turnaround specialist, someone with experience salvaging companies from founder incompetence. They'll be competent, efficient, and completely indifferent to the human cost of their efficiency." Frank refilled his water glass, the motion deliberate. 6 months from now, Reed Dynamics will be profitable, and half the workforce will be unemployed. "That's manipulation. That's reality." Frank's voice held no apology. "I can't force you to take this job, and I won't try. But I'm not going to pretend the choice doesn't have consequences for people beyond yourself. Leadership means accepting that your decisions affect everyone downstream." Elena pushed away from the table, walked to the window overlooking the garden. The rain had stopped, leaving everything glistening under the emerging moon. "What if I'm not ready? What if I fail?" "Then you fail, surrounded by people who'll help you get back up." Frank came to stand beside her. "Marcus failed alone because he never admitted he needed help. You'll fail if you fail because you tried something worth trying. There's honor in that." She thought about the employees she'd glimpsed during Marcus's perp walk, their faces reflecting the terror of economic uncertainty. Thought about the firefighters and teachers whose retirements Marcus had gambled with. Thought about her own algorithms still running in the company's systems, keeping medical supplies flowing to hospitals across the West Coast, her invisible contribution to infrastructure that saved lives daily. "I need the weekend to think about it," she said finally. "No calls, no emails, no pressure, just time to figure out who I am without Marcus defining me by absence." "Take the time you need." Frank squeezed her shoulder gently. "The job will still be there Monday morning." That night, Elena lay in her childhood bed staring at ceiling stars she'd stuck up there in 6th grade, their glow faded but persistent. Her phone sat silent on the nightstand, powered off completely, the first time in years she'd disconnected from the digital leash of constant availability. She thought about Vanessa's question. Why had she stayed? Not in the marriage that she understood as the slow accumulation of compromises that seemed reasonable individually, but catastrophic collectively. But why had she stayed silent about her contributions? Why had she let Marcus take credit for work that was fundamentally hers? The answer was uncomfortable because she'd believed that his success was their success. That supporting him was the same as supporting their partnership. That love meant diminishing yourself to make room for the other person's growth. She'd been wrong. Love didn't require self-erasure. Partnership didn't mean one person glowing while the other provided invisible fuel. She'd confused sacrifice with love, and by the time she'd recognized the difference, she'd sacrificed so much of herself that climbing back seemed impossible. But here she was on the other side of impossible, holding the pieces of what Marcus had tried to destroy, and realizing they weren't as broken as she'd feared. Damaged, yes. Changed, certainly. But not destroyed. Never destroyed. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless, the kind of unconsciousness that only comes from emotional exhaustion, so complete that the body simply shuts down to protect itself. She woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. For a moment, displacement disoriented her. This wasn't the penthouse, wasn't the firm mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets Marcus had insisted on. This was the cottage, the narrow bed with the hand-quilted comforter her grandmother had made the morning routine of her father moving through the kitchen below. Her phone, powered back on, showed 37 missed calls and 62 text messages. She scrolled through them mechanically. Reporters requesting comment, former Stanford colleagues expressing support, 3 from Vanessa's attorney, confirming Monday's meeting, 1 from Sterling, with a subject line reading, "Media Strategy Call ASAP," and 1 from a number she didn't recognize, time-stamped at 2 in the morning. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but you don't understand what you've started. M. Marcus." Threatening her from whatever hole he'd crawled into after his public humiliation. The message should have frightened her, should have triggered the old anxiety responses he'd conditioned into her over 5 years of emotional manipulation. Instead, she felt nothing but a distant clinical interest in his psychology, the narcissist's inability to accept defeat, the rage at being held accountable, the need to reassert control even from a position of powerlessness. She forwarded the message to Sterling with a note, "Add to the file, possible witness intimidation." His response came within minutes, screenshotted and filed. "If he contacts you again, do not respond. We'll handle it legally." Downstairs, Frank was making pancakes, the griddle sizzling with butter and batter. "You look better," he observed, flipping a perfectly golden cake. "More like yourself." "I feel like I'm surfacing after being underwater for years." Elena poured coffee from the French press, added cream. "Everything's sharper, clearer, but also overwhelming, like sensory overload after sensory deprivation." "That's the fog lifting. Marcus kept you in an emotional smokescreen where you couldn't see clearly enough to recognize how bad things had gotten." Frank plated the pancakes, adding real maple syrup from a small farm in Vermont. "Now you're seeing reality, and reality's always sharper than comfortable delusion." They ate breakfast on the porch, watching hummingbirds dart between feeders Frank had hung throughout the garden. The normalcy of it, pancakes and birds and morning sun, felt surreal against the backdrop of corporate warfare and federal investigations. "I want to see the company," Elena said suddenly. "Not the executive suite or the boardroom. I want to see the engineering floor, the warehouse, the customer service center. I want to talk to the people who actually make Reed Dynamics work." Frank nodded slowly, understanding. "Not as potential CEO, as someone deciding whether the company deserves saving." "Exactly." They spent Saturday touring Reed Dynamics' facilities, Frank having arranged access through his board authority. Elena wore jeans and a Stanford hoodie, her hair pulled back, no makeup, looking more like a grad student than an executive. The disguise was deliberate. She wanted to see the company as it actually was, not the performance version employees showed to leadership. The engineering floor buzzed with controlled chaos, developers clustered around monitors, whiteboards covered in algorithms and system diagrams. Elena recognized her own work in the code they were debugging, the routing optimization she'd written years ago, now being maintained and extended by a team that probably didn't know its original author was touring their workspace. A young developer, barely out of college by her appearance, was wrestling with a particularly complex section. Elena watched over her shoulder, spotted the error immediately, a recursive call that would create an infinite loop under specific conditions. "Try adding a depth check before the recursion," she suggested quietly. "Limit it to 10 iterations with a fallback to the default route." The developer looked up, startled, then tried the suggestion. The code compiled cleanly, the error disappearing. "Oh my God, that's perfect. How did you—" She stopped, recognition dawning. "You're Elena Hayes. You're the one who wrote the original logistics engine." "I had some input." Elena deflected, but the developer was already pulling up the code repository history, showing commit logs from years ago with Elena's username attached. "Input. You built the entire foundation. We've been studying your algorithms, trying to understand the optimization techniques. Some of us thought you were multiple people because the code quality was so consistently high across different modules. The developer's enthusiasm was infectious, genuine admiration from someone who understood the technical achievement. "Are you coming back? Please tell me you're coming back. We've been trying to extend your work to handle autonomous medical drones, and it's been a disaster." The Helix Project. Elena felt her expression harden. "I saw the disaster. That's why I'm here." Word spread through the engineering floor with digital speed. The original architect was back, the woman whose code had built the company, while the CEO took credit. Developers gathered, asking questions about design decisions, explaining problems they'd encountered, seeking guidance on extensions and optimizations. For the first time in 5 years, Elena felt the intellectual engagement she'd been starving for. These people didn't care about her marital status or whether she fit Marcus's image of a billionaire's wife. They cared about her code, her expertise, her ability to solve problems they'd been struggling with for months. The autonomous routing for Helix failed because someone removed the safety margins I'd built into the original algorithm, she explained to the small crowd that had gathered. Those margins weren't inefficiency, they were fault tolerance for GPS signal degradation and unpredicted wind shear. Remove them, and you get optimal performance in perfect conditions and catastrophic failure in reality. A senior developer pulled up the Helix code, and Elena could see immediately where Marcus's hand-picked team had gutted her safety protocols in favor of raw performance metrics. "This is criminal negligence," she said flatly. "You can't optimize away physics. Wind exists. Signal interference exists. You have to design for worst-case scenarios in anything that flies." The warehouse was next a massive facility in South Seattle where the logistics algorithms became physical reality. Conveyor belts moved packages with balletic precision, robotic arms sorting medications and equipment for distribution to hospitals across the Pacific Northwest. The system Elena had designed was processing roughly 40,000 items per day, each one routed optimally based on urgency, destination, and available transport. The warehouse manager, a woman named Patricia, who'd been with the company since its founding, gave them a tour with the pride of someone who understood she was managing something important. "Your system saves lives," she told Elena bluntly. "Hospital in Yakima needs emergency blood supply. We have it routed and on a medical courier within 12 minutes. Critical pediatric medication for Seattle children's 8 minutes. The old manual system took hours." Elena watched the choreography of logistics made manifest, seeing her abstract algorithms become concrete action. Each package represented a person who needed help, and her work, her invisible, uncredited work, was getting that help to them as efficiently as possible. "How many people work here?" she asked Patricia. 473 employees across 3 shifts, plus another 100 contractors during peak medical supply season, flu season, mostly when vaccine and medication distribution spikes. Patricia pulled up staffing records on her tablet. "Good jobs, too. Starting wage is $22 an hour, full benefits, profit sharing. We've got people who've been here 8 years, raised families on these wages." 473 people whose livelihoods depended on Reed Dynamics surviving. Not abstract numbers on a spreadsheet, but people with children and mortgages and lives built on the assumption that their employer wouldn't implode from founder fraud. The customer service center was the final stop, a call center where representatives handled hospital inquiries, coordinated emergency deliveries, and resolved supply chain issues. Elena listened to calls on supervisor headsets, hearing the stress in hospital administrators' voices when critical supplies ran late, the relief when problems got solved, the trust they placed in Reed Dynamics to keep their operations running. "Without you, people die," a supervisor told her matter-of-factly. "Not dramatically, not immediately, but if hospitals can't get supplies when they need them, patient outcomes deteriorate. Your logistics system is literally life support infrastructure for regional healthcare." The weight of responsibility settled on Elena's shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't about Marcus or revenge or even justice. This was about 6,000 people whose jobs she could save or sacrifice, about hospitals that depended on infrastructure she'd built, about a system that worked because she'd designed it to work. By the time they returned to the cottage Saturday evening, Elena's decision had crystallized. Not from ambition or vengeance or anything as simple as either, but from the fundamental understanding that walking away would harm people who didn't deserve it. "I'll take the job," she told Frank over dinner. "Not permanently, I'm not ready for that commitment, but interim CEO for 6 months while we stabilize the company and find the right leadership." "What changed your mind?" 473 people in the warehouse, developers trying to extend my work, hospitals depending on logistics I designed. It's not about Marcus anymore. It's about whether I'm the kind of person who walks away when people need help I can provide. She met her father's eyes. "I'm not that person." Frank's smile was proud but tempered with concern. "It won't be easy. The press will be brutal. Shareholders will question your experience. And Marcus—" He paused. "Marcus won't accept defeat gracefully. Marcus texted me at 2 a.m. threatening that this isn't over." Elena showed him the message. "He's already not accepting defeat gracefully." "Then we make sure the legal system accepts it for him." Frank pulled out his phone, typed a message. "Sterling's filing for a restraining order Monday morning. No contact with you company employees or anyone connected to the investigation." Sunday passed in preparation, Frank coaching Elena on board politics and Sterling walking her through the legal landscape via video conference. The SEC investigation was proceeding rapidly, the evidence Vanessa had provided giving them everything needed for criminal charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office was preparing indictments for securities fraud, wire fraud, and federal bribery charges. "Trial's likely 18 months out," Sterling explained, "but the indictment will come within weeks. Marcus will be arrested, arraigned, and released on bond pending trial. The restraining order will be part of his bond conditions. Violating it means jail time." "What kind of sentence is he looking at?" "If convicted on all counts, 20 to 25 years in federal prison. He'll serve minimum 85% before parole eligibility. He's looking at the end of his professional life and most of his personal one." The magnitude of it should have felt victorious. Instead, Elena felt only a distant sadness for the man Marcus could have been if he'd chosen differently, if he'd valued integrity over image, partnership over domination, the truth over his carefully constructed mythology. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, Seattle's skyline sharp against autumn blue sky. Elena dressed in a charcoal suit, professional without being aggressive, authoritative without being ostentatious. Her mother's white suit stayed in the closet. That had been for battle. This was for leadership. The board meeting convened at 9 sharp in Reed Dynamics' main conference room, 13 directors representing various investor blocks and expertise areas. They stood when Elena entered, a gesture of respect that Marcus had always demanded but never earned. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built empires in shadows, "we're here to discuss interim leadership during the transition period. Ms. Hayes has agreed to serve as interim CEO for 6 months while we stabilize operations and conduct a comprehensive search for permanent leadership." The vote was unanimous, each director understanding that Elena represented their best chance at salvaging their investments. She was sworn in with the simple board resolution, no ceremony or fanfare, just the assumption of responsibility that had always been hers anyway. Her first act as CEO was addressing the workforce, a company-wide video call with all 6,000 employees joining from locations across 3 states. She'd prepared remarks with Sterling's help, balancing honesty about the challenges with hope about the future. "I'm not going to pretend the past week hasn't been devastating," she told them, her face projected on screens from warehouse floors to customer service centers to engineering labs. "The founder of this company committed serious crimes. The consequences of those crimes will affect all of us. But here's what I need you to understand. You didn't build a criminal enterprise. You built infrastructure that saves lives. You wrote code that works. You process supplies that hospitals depend on. That work has value independent of who was signing the paychecks." She paused, letting the words settle. "My job for the next 6 months is to preserve that value, to make sure your work continues, your paychecks clear, and your contributions get recognized. I can't promise it will be easy or that everything will stay the same, but I can promise that every decision I make will prioritize the people who actually make this company function." The response was overwhelming emails of support flooding her inbox managers, reporting that morale had shifted from panicked to cautiously hopeful. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the foundation trust could build on. Vanessa's testimony to the U.S. attorney happened that afternoon, Elena sitting in on the deposition via video to understand the full scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise. Watching Vanessa methodically detail each crime, provide supporting documentation, and answer prosecutors' questions with unnerving precision drove home just how comprehensively Marcus had destroyed himself. The indictment came down Wednesday morning. Federal marshals arresting Marcus at a hotel in Portland where he'd been hiding since his exodus from Seattle. The perp walk made national news footage of him in handcuffs being led into the federal courthouse, his expensive suit rumpled and his face showing the strain of 3 days without sleep or proper grooming. Elena watched the coverage from her new office, not Marcus's corner suite, but a smaller workspace she'd claimed that had better light and less ego. She felt nothing watching him shuffled in chains, no satisfaction or vindication, just the weary recognition that this was always how it was going to end once he'd chosen fraud over integrity. Her phone rang Sterling's name on the caller ID. "He violated the restraining order," he said without preamble. "Tried to call your cell phone from the holding facility. The call was blocked automatically, but he left a voice message on the jail's general system demanding to speak with you." "What did he say?" The usual narcissist's desperate plea. "This is all a misunderstanding. If you just explain to the prosecutors that it was your idea that you manipulated him, they'll understand." Sterling's disgust was audible. "The recordings being added to the case file as evidence of witness tampering. The judge is likely to revoke his bond." "Good." Elena surprised herself with the flatness of the word. A week ago the thought of Marcus in jail would have troubled her. Now it just seemed like natural consequence meeting unnatural action. The revocation hearing happened Friday afternoon, the judge reviewing the restraining order violation and the witness tampering evidence with the stony expression of someone who'd seen this pattern too many times. "Mr. Reed, you were released on $1 million bond with specific conditions prohibiting contact with potential witnesses. You violated those conditions within 72 hours. The judge's voice carried the weight of finality. "Bond is revoked. You'll remain in federal custody pending trial." Marcus's attorney objected, argued, pleaded, but the decision was made. Marcus would spend the next 18 months in a detention facility awaiting trial. The billion-dollar CEO reduced to an inmate number and a cell with concrete walls. Elena received the news via text from Sterling, the message simple. "He's in custody. Won't be bothering you again until trial." She stood at her office window watching Seattle's skyline transform as afternoon light shifted to evening gold and felt the final chains of her marriage dissolve into irrelevance. Marcus was gone, not just physically, but psychologically. The man who'd occupied so much of her emotional landscape had been reduced to a legal proceeding. A cautionary tale, a chapter closed. What remained was the work rebuilding trust, stabilizing operations, honoring the contributions of people who'd never received credit. And somewhere beyond the 6-month interim appointment, maybe discovering who Elena Hayes could become when she wasn't defining herself in opposition to or support of someone else. The future was uncertain, terrifying in its openness. But it was hers. 9 months after Marcus's arrest, Elena stood in a community garden in Tacoma dirt under her fingernails and sweat dampening her Stanford hoodie, feeling more herself than she had in the entirety of her marriage. The garden was part of a Titan global corporate responsibility initiative, transforming a vacant lot into a space where neighbors could grow vegetables and children could learn where food actually came from. She'd volunteered on a Saturday morning, needing a break from boardrooms and balance sheets, craving the simple clarity of making things grow. A man about her age knelt 3 rows over, installing an irrigation system with the focused competence of someone who understood both engineering and agriculture. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms tanned from outdoor work. His hair was dark brown, slightly too long, and he hummed while he worked, a rarity in Elena's experience, people who found joy in labor rather than viewing it as necessary suffering. "You're putting those tomato plants too close together," he said without looking up from his irrigation work. "They'll compete for nutrients, and you'll get stunted growth on both." Elena looked at the spacing she'd been using, realized he was right, and felt defensive anyway. The planting guide said 8 inches. The planting guide assumes ideal soil conditions and consistent watering. This is urban soil that's been compacted by construction equipment. You need 12 inches minimum to give them room to establish root systems. He stood wiping his hands on his jeans and walked over with an easy stride that suggested comfort in his own skin. "Here, let me show you." He knelt beside her, demonstrating the proper spacing with gentle hands that handled the seedlings like they mattered. Up close, she could see laugh lines around his eyes and a fading scar on his chin, the marks of someone who'd lived a life outside air-conditioned offices. "I'm Daniel Foster." He introduced himself, offering a dirt-streaked hand. "Landscape architect. I designed this garden layout." "Elena." She shook his hand, noting the calluses that came from actual physical labor. "I work in tech management." "Let me guess, Amazon, Microsoft. One of the big players." His tone was curious rather than impressed, the question practical rather than status-seeking. "Smaller company. Read Dynamics." She watched his face for recognition, but saw only polite interest. "Never heard of it, but I don't really follow the tech sector. My ex-wife worked at Amazon and it was all she ever talked about. Stock options and performance reviews and competitive culture. Drove me crazy." He returned to adjusting her tomato plants, his movements practiced. "I prefer work you can actually see at the end of the day. Plant a garden, the garden grows. Build a park, people use it. Simple cause and effect." The casual mention of an ex-wife created a small opening, permission to acknowledge shared experience. "My ex-husband was in tech too. He forgot that simple cause and effect applies to people as well as plants. Treat people like disposable resources, eventually they dispose of you." Daniel laughed, the sound genuine and unforced. "That's one way to put it. Mine forgot that marriage requires actually being present. She was physically in our house, but mentally always at the office. By the time she realized what she'd lost, I'd already moved on." They worked in comfortable silence. After that, the conversation shifting to practical matters of soil composition and water retention, and which vegetables thrived in Pacific Northwest microclimates. It was the first conversation Elena had in months that didn't involve legal proceedings, financial restructuring, or corporate strategy. It felt like breathing after holding her breath underwater. When the volunteer session ended, Daniel handed her a business card embossed with a simple logo of a tree. "We're having a potluck next Saturday. Volunteers and neighbors. You should come. Bring your dad if he likes gardens. You mentioned he's into horticulture." Elena pocketed the card, surprised by how much she wanted to say yes. "I might do that." Driving back to Seattle, she caught herself smiling without reason, the unfamiliar sensation almost alarming. The past 9 months had been consumed by the work of salvaging Read Dynamics, testifying in depositions, and learning to be a leader rather than support staff. Romance hadn't even registered as a possibility, her emotional bandwidth fully occupied by corporate triage. But Daniel Foster, with his dirt-stained hands and uncomplicated joy in making things grow, had created a small space in her thoughts where something other than work could exist. The following Saturday found Elena and Frank at the community garden potluck, Elena having made her grandmother's potato salad, while Frank brought fresh vegetables from his own garden. The gathering was exactly what Daniel had promised, unpretentious and warm neighbors sharing food and stories without the performative networking that characterized every social event Marcus had dragged her to. Daniel found her by the drink table, 2 plastic cups of lemonade in hand. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." I needed a reminder that the world contains things besides corporate restructuring and federal investigations. She accepted the lemonade, noting the way he'd remembered she'd chosen it over soda at the volunteer session. "Federal investigation sounds intense." his eyebrows raised with concern rather than prurient curiosity. "Everything okay?" "Getting there. My ex-husband made some spectacularly bad decisions. I'm helping clean up the aftermath." It was the simplest version of the truth, close enough to honest, without requiring explanation. Frank appeared beside them, hands full of vegetables he'd been discussing with another gardener. "Daniel, right, Elena mentioned you designed this space. Beautiful work. The drainage system is particularly clever." What followed was a deep dive into soil composition and sustainable irrigation that left Elena smiling at her father's enthusiasm. Frank in his element, discussing practical matters with someone who shared his passion, was a reminder of who he'd chosen to be despite having enough wealth to never touch dirt again. "Your dad's great," Daniel observed after Frank wandered off to examine the composting system. "My dad's a union electrician. Same kind of honest competence, just does the work because it needs doing." The comparison made Elena's chest tight with affection and amusement. If Daniel only knew that the man he was comparing to a union electrician owned a trillion-dollar empire and had just destroyed a CEO for fraud. But that was Frank's genius, the ability to be genuinely himself, regardless of the wealth hidden behind corporate structures. Over the next month, Elena and Daniel fell into an easy pattern. Coffee on Saturday mornings before garden work, lunch at food trucks near whichever project he was currently designing. Dinner at her apartment, not the penthouse which she'd gladly abandoned, but a modest two-bedroom in Fremont, with a view of the canal and neighbors who were artists and engineers and people who worked for livings rather than portfolios. Daniel knew she worked in management at a tech company. Knew her father was involved somehow, though the specifics remained vague. Knew her ex-husband had committed crimes that left her dealing with legal complications. But he didn't press for details, seemed content to know her as Elena, rather than CEO Elena or victim Elena or any of the other roles that had defined her in the news coverage. 3 months into whatever they were building, Daniel's sister invited them to dinner at her house in Olympia. "Fair warning," he told Elena during the drive south. "Jessica's a nurse and she has strong opinions about everything. She'll interrogate you about your intentions, your job, probably your credit score if she can work it into conversation." Protective older sister, Elena guessed, familiar with the dynamic from watching friends' families. Protective younger sister, which is worse. She thinks I need defending from my own poor judgment. He smiled, affectionate despite the words. She's not wrong. My track record on relationships is pretty terrible. Jessica's house was small and chaotic, filled with the kind of comfortable disorder that comes from actually living rather than staging. 3 children under 10 raced through the rooms, while Jessica's husband attempted to corral them toward the dinner table with limited success. "So you're Elena," Jessica announced, shaking hands with the firm grip of someone used to handling medical emergencies. "Daniel says you work in tech. What do you do specifically?" "I run a logistics company. We handle medical supply distribution for hospitals across the Pacific Northwest." It was technically accurate while being completely misleading about scale. "Read Dynamics." Jessica's eyes sharpened. "I've heard of you guys. Seattle Children's uses your system for critical medication routing. Saved one of my patients last month when we needed emergency antivenin. Your system had it delivered in under 30 minutes. The praise made Elena flush with something between pride and embarrassment. "That's what we're there for. The algorithm optimizes for time-critical supplies by maintaining distributed inventory across strategic locations." "You designed the algorithm." Daniel's interest was clear, connecting dots he hadn't previously had pieces for. "Parts of it. It's been a collaborative effort." She pivoted the conversation away from her own contributions, uncomfortable with claiming credit even when it was legitimately hers. Dinner was loud and warm, the children's chaos providing cover for adult conversation that ranged from Jessica's hospital politics to Daniel's current project designing a public park in Tacoma to Elena's carefully vague descriptions of corporate challenges. She found herself relaxing into the normalcy of it, the mundane concerns of people whose dramas didn't make national news. After dinner, Jessica pulled her aside under the pretense of showing her the garden. "He really likes you," she said bluntly. maternal protectiveness evident in every syllable. My brother's been hurt before. His ex-wife made him feel small because he wasn't ambitious enough for her definition of success. If you're going to hurt him, do it now before he gets more invested. The echo of Marcus calling her small resonated painfully. I would never make someone feel small for being who they are. That's a particular cruelty I've experienced firsthand. Jessica studied her face, nurse's eyes cataloging micro-expressions and tells. Good, because Daniel's not flashy or ambitious in conventional ways, but he's good, genuinely good in a way that's rare, and he deserves someone who sees that. I see it. Elena meant it completely, the honesty surprising her with its depth. He's the first person in years who's made me feel like being myself is enough. Driving back to Seattle, Daniel reached across the console and took her hand. Thank you for surviving my sister's interrogation. She means well, but she's about as subtle as a cardiac emergency. She loves you. That's worth protecting. Elena squeezed his hand, grateful for the simplicity of skin-on-skin connection without complication. Can I tell you something? His voice carried a nervous edge that suggested he'd been holding this back. I know who you are, or I know more than you've told me. Elena's stomach dropped. What do you mean? My sister sent me a news article about a month ago. Seattle CEO takes over after founder's fraud conviction. Elena Hayes, daughter of Titan Global Chairman, interim CEO of Reed Dynamics. Stanford MBA, top of her class. The article had your photo. He kept his eyes on the road, giving her space to react without the pressure of eye contact. I didn't say anything because I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me, and honestly, I liked that you felt comfortable enough to just be Elena instead of CEO Elena. Relief and anxiety warred in Elena's chest. Why didn't you say something? Because the woman I've been falling for is the one who plants tomatoes wrong and argues about irrigation efficiency and laughs at terrible puns about composting. The CEO stuff is what you do. It's not who you are. He glanced at her, briefly vulnerable in the dashboard light. At least that's what I'm hoping. That the person I've been getting to know is the real you. She is. Elena's voice came out rough with emotion. More real than I've been in years. Marcus, my ex, he wanted me to be an accessory to his success. You're the first person who seemed interested in me, separate from any role or title or use I could provide. Daniel pulled the car into a rest stop, parking under the yellow glow of sodium lights. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I don't care that you're a CEO or that your dad's a billionaire or whatever. I care that you get excited about sustainable urban design and you volunteer at community gardens and you remembered my niece's birthday when I mentioned it once in passing. That's the person I want to know better. She kissed him. Then the first real kiss they'd shared, and felt something unlock in her chest that Marcus had bolted shut years ago. Permission to be wanted for herself rather than her utility. Permission to take up space without apologizing. Permission to be seen as whole rather than as supporting cast in someone else's narrative. 1 year after the divorce, Elena stood in her father's Hamptons garden watching Daniel sketch plans for expanding the rose beds. Frank had invited them for the weekend, ostensibly to get Daniel's professional opinion on garden renovation, but really to spend time with the man his daughter was clearly falling for. He's good for you, Frank observed, handing her a glass of iced tea and settling into the porch chair beside her. You laugh more, worry less. Actually take weekends off instead of treating them as bonus work time. He reminds me that there's life outside corporate crisis management. Elena watched Daniel measure soil drainage, his movements economical and purposeful. I forgot that was possible. The board wants to make your appointment permanent, Frank said, shifting to business despite the pastoral setting. 9 months of increasing profits, restored investor confidence, and 0 additional scandals. You've stabilized the company ahead of every projection. Elena had been expecting this conversation, dreading it even. I told them 6 months. It's been 9. I've stayed longer than I promised. You've also discovered you're good at it. The employees trust you. The clients respect you. The technology sector is starting to recognize Reed Dynamics as an innovator again rather than a fraud case study. Frank sipped his tea, patient and persistent. Why walk away from something you've built? Because I don't know if I'm doing it because I want to or because I feel obligated to. The honesty felt risky even with her father. Every decision I make, I question whether it's what Elena Hayes wants or what the situation demands. I've spent so much time being what other people needed that I'm not sure how to separate my wants from my responsibilities. Then maybe the question isn't whether to stay or go. Maybe it's what would make you happy regardless of responsibility or expectation. Frank set down his glass, his full attention on her. If the company could run itself, if 6,000 employees didn't depend on your leadership, if you had complete freedom to choose, what would you want? Elena considered the question seriously, looking past the immediate pressures to the bedrock of desire beneath. I'd want to split my time. Research and development 3 days a week, actual hands-on algorithm design. Strategic leadership 2 days. And time completely disconnected from work where I'm just a person who volunteers at gardens and goes hiking with someone who makes me laugh. That's completely achievable. Hire a COO to handle daily operations. You focus on innovation and strategy. Work-life balance becomes a structural feature rather than an aspiration. Frank smiled at her surprise. You're the CEO, ladybug. You get to design the job to fit your life instead of warping your life to fit the job. The simplicity of it was almost offensive. Why hadn't she considered that leadership could be customized rather than endured? But the answer was obvious because Marcus had modeled leadership as all-consuming martyrdom performance art of the perpetually busy. She'd internalized his model without questioning whether it was the only option. 2 months later, Elena hired a COO, a brilliant operations specialist from Microsoft, who loved the tactical minutiae of daily management that Elena found stifling. The division of labor transformed her experience of leadership from drowning to swimming, the job becoming something she could do sustainably rather than something that consumed everything. She split her weeks as planned, Monday through Wednesday in research and development, working directly with engineers on the next generation of medical logistics algorithms. Thursday and Friday in strategic leadership, guiding company direction and major decisions. Weekends completely off a boundary she enforced with the ferocity of someone who'd learned the cost of endless availability. Daniel moved into her apartment 6 months after their first kiss, his presence transforming the space from shelter into home. He filled the place with plants, not decorative arrangements, but functional gardens on the balcony, herbs for cooking, vegetables in clever vertical planters. The apartment smelled of soil and growing things, life asserting itself in the middle of urban density. They developed rhythms and rituals. Saturday mornings at community gardens, Sunday brunches with Frank, weeknight dinners where they cooked together and talked about everything except work. Daniel's world of public park design and sustainable urban planning expanded Elena's perspective beyond corporate concerns, reminding her that success could be measured in children playing in spaces that didn't exist before, in neighbors growing food in lots that had been vacant, in small acts of beauty that made cities more livable. Marcus's trial happened in its own timeline, a parallel universe Elena visited only when subpoenaed to testify. She spent 3 days on the witness stand, prosecutors walking her through the timeline of her contributions and Marcus's appropriations, his fraud, and her unknowing complicity. The defense attorney tried to paint her as a scorned woman seeking revenge, suggesting she'd fabricated evidence or exaggerated her role to destroy Marcus's reputation. The jury didn't buy it. Her testimony was too detailed, too technical, too obviously from someone who understood the work at a fundamental level. Marcus sat at the defense table looking smaller than she remembered, his expensive suits replaced by off-the-rack courtroom attire, his hair gone gray at the temples. He watched her testify with an expression that cycled between rage and something that might have been regret, though with narcissists it was hard to distinguish genuine emotion from performative manipulation. The verdict came back guilty on 14 counts. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks later. Judge Morrison reviewing victim impact statements from defrauded investors and employees whose pensions Marcus had gambled with. Mr. Reed, You were given every advantage, education, opportunity, access to capital. You used those advantages not to build something meaningful, but to construct an elaborate fraud designed to enrich yourself at others' expense. Judge Morrison's voice carried the weight of 30 years on the bench, having seen every variation of white-collar crime and the justifications that accompanied them. You stole from firefighters' retirement funds, teachers' savings, nurses who'd worked 40 years on the promise that the market would honor their sacrifice. You endangered lives with the Helix project, cutting safety protocols to meet deadlines driven by ego rather than engineering reality. She paused, letting the charges settle. The court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison on each count to run concurrently. You'll be eligible for parole after serving 85%, approximately 17 years. By the time you're released, you'll be 55 years old with a felony record that precludes you from ever serving as a corporate officer again. Marcus's face crumpled, the reality of nearly 2 decades in prison finally penetrating his armor of denial. Elena watched from his gallery, feeling nothing resembling satisfaction, just the heavy recognition that this was always how it had to end once he'd chosen fraud over integrity. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed asking for her reaction. Elena gave them a prepared statement Sterling had drafted. "Justice has been served. My focus now is on the 6,000 employees of Reed Dynamics who deserve a company worthy of their talent and dedication." She walked away from the cameras, from the spectacle of Marcus's destruction, from the chapter of her life he'd dominated. Daniel waited at the corner, deliberately apart from the media circus, and she walked into his arms with the relief of someone reaching solid ground after swimming through storms. "How do you feel?" He asked the question genuine rather than performative. "Free," she answered, surprised by the truth of it. "Like I can finally stop looking backward and just move forward." 3 years after signing divorce papers with flowers still dusting her hands, Elena stood in her father's garden watching preparations for her wedding to Daniel. The ceremony would be small, 50 people maximum, close friends and family, the community garden volunteers who'd become their found family, a handful of Reed Dynamics executives who'd proven themselves during the crisis. She wore a simple cream dress, elegant without being ostentatious, comfortable enough to actually move in. Daniel's sister was her maid of honor, having long since decided Elena met her protective standards. Frank would walk her down a path between rose beds he'd cultivated specifically for this occasion, each bloom a testament to patient care and strategic planning. Vanessa Chen had sent a card, not an invitation acceptance since she hadn't been invited, but an acknowledgement. "Congratulations on building something real. I'm still working on figuring out what that means, V." The message held no bitterness, just the recognition of paths diverging toward different definitions of success. The ceremony itself was brief, officiated by a judge who was Frank's friend and who'd agreed to keep the legal jargon minimal. Elena and Daniel had written their own vows, promises grounded in specific knowledge rather than generic romance. "I promise to see you," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "Not a role or a title or what I need you to be, but actually you. The brilliant engineer who argues about algorithm optimization at 2 in the morning, the volunteer who gets irrationally invested in tomato plant survival, the woman who's stronger than she knows and kinder than she realizes." Elena's vows came from equally deep places. "I promise to trust you with my actual self, not a performance designed to fit someone else's expectations. To take up space without apologizing. To build a life with you that's ours, rather than an obligation to anyone else's vision of what we should be." Frank gave a toast after the ceremony, his glass of champagne catching afternoon light. "To my daughter who learned the hard way that you can't build happiness on someone else's foundation, and to Daniel who had the wisdom to see that foundations built from honesty might start smaller, but grow stronger." The reception was exactly what Elena had wanted. Casual, warm, filled with laughter and genuine conversation rather than networking opportunities. The food was catered by local restaurants Daniel had worked with on community projects. The music was a playlist they'd built together over months of discovering each other's tastes. The decorations were flowers from Frank's garden, each arrangement carrying his meticulous care. Elena danced with her father to a song her mother had loved, Frank's steps, still confident despite his age. "She would be proud of you," he said quietly. The words meant only for her. Not for surviving Marcus, but for remembering who you were before he convinced you to be smaller. "I had a good teacher in being myself," Elena responded, squeezing his hand. Someone who could have been anything but chose to be exactly who he wanted to be, regardless of expectation. As evening settled into the garden and guests mingled under string lights, Elena found herself on the porch with Daniel, watching their combined worlds overlap with surprising ease. Engineers discussing park design with landscape architects. Community garden volunteers swapping stories with Reed Dynamics employees. Her father in deep conversation with Daniel's union electrician father about the dignity of skilled labor. "No regrets?" Daniel asked, his arm around her waist, the question encompassing everything: the marriage, the career, the choices that had led to this moment. Elena considered the path from that penthouse where Marcus had handed her divorce papers to this garden where she'd just promised forever to someone who'd never asked her to be anything but herself. "Only that I didn't get here sooner, but maybe I needed the detour to appreciate the destination." Years later, when Reed Dynamics celebrated becoming the largest medical logistics provider in North America, when Elena's algorithms became the industry standard for time-critical supply distribution, when she published research that transformed autonomous medical drone safety protocols, people would ask about her success story. They'd want to know about rising from divorce and corporate scandal to industry leadership. But the success Elena measured herself by wasn't the company's valuation, or the awards accumulating in her office, or even the lives saved by infrastructure she'd designed. It was the ability to work 3 days a week on problems that engaged her mind completely, spend 2 days guiding strategic direction, and disconnect entirely for weekends spent planting gardens and hiking trails and building a life with someone who loved her for reasons that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. It was mornings drinking coffee on a balcony filled with vegetables Daniel had grown, discussing his latest park design and her current algorithm challenge with equal investment. It was volunteering at community gardens and teaching neighborhood kids about sustainable urban agriculture. It was dinners with her father where they talked about roses and rare earth minerals and the philosophy of building things that lasted. Success was the freedom to define her own terms rather than accepting someone else's metrics. The courage to say no to opportunities that looked impressive but felt hollow. The wisdom to recognize that being seen, truly seen not as utility or accessory, but as complete, was worth more than any valuation or title. Marcus served his sentence in Otisville Federal Correctional Institution, a medium-security facility in upstate New York. Elena never visited, never responded to the letters he sent during his first year of incarceration, never engaged with his attempts to rewrite history into a narrative where he was the victim of ambitious underlings and vindictive ex-wives. Eventually, the letters stopped. Eventually, Marcus accepted that the life he'd built on fraud and ego had collapsed completely, the rubble too scattered to reassemble. Eventually, he became just another inmate counting days toward a parole hearing that would come when he was middle-aged and starting over with nothing. Elena didn't forgive him. Forgiveness felt like an irrelevant category for what he'd done, but she stopped defining herself in opposition to him, stopped measuring her choices against the template of their marriage. He became background noise in her story, rather than the plot, a character who'd appeared and exited, leaving her with lessons learned the hard way, but learned completely. In the garden her father had built, surrounded by people who loved her for herself, Elena Hayes understood that revenge was a poor substitute for living well. Justice mattered, consequences mattered, but what mattered most was remembering that small was a choice, and she'd chosen to be infinite.